This video will focus on evolution by natural selection. After watching the video, you should be able to describe some of the early ideas of evolutionary theory. You should also be able to interpret phylogenetic trees, including the relationships among different lineages of organisms. You should be able to explain the concepts of homology and also convergent evolution. And finally, you should be able to explain Darwin's postulates of natural selection. So let's begin by just addressing a very fundamental question. What do we mean by evolution? So at the most basic level, we're talking about genetically based changes in characteristics in populations over time. Or another way to think about that is a change in the frequency of certain alleles over time. We'll come back to that concept of allele frequencies in our next chapter in a little more detail. So let's now take a few minutes and just think about some of the early ideas regarding evolution. So thousands of years ago, at the time of Plato and Aristotle, people thought that species were fixed entities. They didn't change at all over time. Aristotle, he argued that yes, species are fixed entities. They don't change over time, but we can recognize so-called lower organisms, such as plants and mushrooms, and more higher organisms, such as animals, of course, ultimately culminating in humans at the apex of this ladder or this scale of nature. But then let's fast forward to the 1700s. Then things started to change a little bit. So we have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He's a French naturalist. He introduced this concept that species could indeed change over time. He still retained some of the earlier ideas regarding this ladder from lower to higher organisms or the scale of nature. But again, he argued that species could evolve over time and change from one species to another. Again, ultimately culminating in humans at the apex of this scale of nature. He also introduced this concept of inheritance of acquired characteristics. It goes something like this. Imagine you go to the gym and you work out every day and you build up really huge bicep muscles. And then the idea is, well, if you were to have kids, you could then pass on those large bicep muscles to your kids. Well, so that would be an acquired characteristic, right? You worked out and developed those large muscles. That's not how it works, right? You wouldn't necessarily uh, pass that on to your kids. They themselves could work out and get large muscles, but that acquired characteristic would not be automatically inherited by your offspring. So we don't, some of his ideas we don't adhere to anymore, but nevertheless, he did sort of argue for this idea that the species could change over time. So that was an important change from earlier ideas. But then a little bit later in the 1800s, we've got Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, who really kind of changed the way that we think about evolutionary relationships. Though you may not have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace, you undoubtedly have heard of Charles Darwin. Essentially, if we just focus on Darwin here, he argued that species can change over time, but rather than thinking about this evolution from lower to higher organisms, we should think in terms of shared or common ancestry. So, for example, we can think about humans and plants, and we can say, well, way back when there is some common ancestor that gave rise to the organisms we now recognize as plants and the organisms that we now recognize as animals. And furthermore, we might think about humans and let's say dogs, for example. We can say humans and dogs we share some common ancestor, and we could say we are more close related to dogs than we are to, let's say, plants, right? That's not to say that dogs evolved into humans or that chimps evolved into humans, but the idea is we share some common ancestry. So what inspired Darwin's thinking? You see a quote on natural selection here. Of course, we'll come back to natural selection in just a bit, but what inspired Darwin to kind of think about evolution from this different perspective? Well, it goes back to some birds that he was observing when he was collecting animals from the HMS Beagle as he was sailing around South America and the Galapagos Islands. And in a nutshell, what he noticed regarding variation in mockingbirds was as follows. So here we see a few of the Galapagos Islands, and we collected mockingbirds from these different islands. He started to recognize that yes, they're different species, they're somewhat similar in their appearance, but the variation that he was seeing between these different islands was more than the variation in mockingbirds that he was seeing in all of South America. Now, that was puzzling to him. He thought, well, how could that be? How can that be explained? Well, he started to think, well, what if some common ancestor, some population of mockingbirds way back when went and colonized the Galapagos Islands? And then over time, they were subject to slightly different selective pressures. And that then would give rise to the different species that we see today. And that's illustrated very schematically toward the bottom in this diagram right here. So this is an example of a phylogenetic tree. Basically, a hypothesized relationship among different lineages of organisms. So these mockingbirds got him thinking in these terms. And of course, we'll come back to his ideas of natural selection in just a bit. But as you can imagine, that radically changed the way that we thought about evolution. So let's say a few more comments about phylogenetic trees and how we interpret relationships among organisms. So here we see a very schematic of a phylogenetic tree. We see humans, dogs, lizards, lungfish. Let's take a look at the humans and the dogs. We can look at humans and say, well, we've got hair, dogs have hair. We also, of course, recognize that cats have hair, horses do, cows do, pigs do, right? All these animals that we would include in this group that we call mammals, right? We all have hair. So we could look at this group here and say, well, hair, this is a feature shared by all of these different lineages. It's possible that hair evolved many times separately in humans and dogs and cats and horses, right? That's possible. But the simpler and perhaps more likely explanation is that hair evolved just once in some common ancestor of humans and dogs and all these other lineages that we recognize as mammals. So that basic approach in terms of interpreting shared characteristics among different lineages, that's a simply, we refer to that as parsimony. So we typically choose the simplest explanation. Not to say that more complex explanations didn't or couldn't occur. Yes, hair could have evolved multiple times, separately and independently in different lineages, but it's just more likely that it evolved once, right, in some common ancestor of all mammals. So that's the concept of parsimony. A few other concepts related to phylogenetic trees. If you think about all of the animals that we call mammals, we might say, well, they form this large group. We all have hair and other traits that we can identify with mammals. So that group might be referred to as a monophyletic group. What we mean by that is essentially any group that includes all of the descendants of some common ancestor and only the descendants of some common ancestor. So for example, we take a look at this top tree here. We might say, well, there's some common ancestor that gave rise to several different lineages, let's say different groups of mammals, for example, but collectively, this includes all of the descendants of this common ancestor. We'd say, well, that's a monophyletic group. On the other hand, if we see a situation like we see toward the bottom here, you might identify some group of organisms illustrated by the blue lineages. But notice we're excluding this one lineage right here. If that's the case, we might say, well, this group here, this does not represent a monophyletic group because it does not include all of the descendants of this common ancestor. And furthermore, if we go back to our monophyletic group up here, yes, we could say this entire group is one monophyletic group. We can also identify this as another monophyletic group. So these three lineages nested within this larger group. We could furthermore say, okay, these two constitute yet another monophyletic group, again, because it includes all the descendants of this particular common ancestor, right? So that's just different ways of thinking about relationships among different groups of organisms when you see them presented as phylogenetic trees. When we think about shared characteristics, whether it be hair or other features as well, in different species, if we see a situation where some characteristic appears to be the result of shared ancestry. So, for example, hair. We'd say, well, that's an example of homology, or hair is homologous among all the different lineages of mammals. As another example, if you take a look at the pattern of bone formation in many groups of tetrapods or different animal groups that we see here, very similar pattern in all these different groups. And so you see one bone followed by two bones, followed by a cluster of bones that make up our wrist, for example, followed by several digits there, right? That pattern is very fundamentally the same in all these different groups of animals. We say, well, those are, I mean, I guess, yes, it's possible that these bone development and developmental patterns evolved separately in these different groups, but it's more likely and it's more easily explained if this pattern of bone formation evolved once and was then modified in these different lineages. So again, we'd say this is an example of homology, right? These similar structures as a result of shared ancestry. Just as another example, we can take a look at flowers. There are well over 250,000 species of flowering plants. So lots of species, and yet they all produce flowers and they have lots of similarities in terms of flower structures that they produce. So we say, well, this large group of organisms we call flowering plants, that's a large monophyletic group. And we could say, okay, the flowers within all those different species, they're all homologous with each other, right? But that's fairly well supported, well documented, but it's not always that straightforward. So for example, if you take a look at this image here, we see a dolphin, right, a common dolphin, and also this extinct ichthyosaur. They look remarkably similar, right? They're both aquatic. They both have this very streamlined body plan to them, good for swimming through water. So you might be tempted to look at those and say, well, that body plan, that streamlined body plan for swimming through water, that's probably homologous, right, in those two lineages. But when you look at that within a larger context, in other words, map these lineages out on a larger phylogenetic tree, what we see is that indeed the dolphins and the ichthyosaurs are very distantly related. And they're separated by lots of different species that don't necessarily have, right, the same body plan that we see here. So in this case, well, that's probably not an example of homology, that body plan. That's something else going on there. This would be a good example of convergent evolution. So these two different lineages, dolphins and ichthyosaurs, they're converging on the same fundamental body shape, right? But they're doing it completely separately and independently of each other. So this would be an example of analogous structures or analogous evolution or convergent evolution. Again, very similar, analogous to each other, but they're not examples of homology. So if we think about this idea that species can change over time, and bodies and physical characteristics can change as well. We can think about this idea of descent with modification, right? So descendants can differ, right, from their ancestral populations. So how does that work? How did Darwin think about these ideas? And how they could explain some of the diversity of life that he was observing when he was on the HMS Beagle collecting all these different species of animals. Well, in a nutshell, Darwin's postulates of natural selection are as follows. He recognized that traits vary in populations, right? Just think about any population of just about any species. you're going to see some variation, right? Think about humans, right? Lots of variation in terms of physical traits in humans within pretty much any population you look at. Some of those differences are genetically based. They're heritable. Unlike Lamarck's ideas of acquired characteristics, right here the focus is on genetically based or heritable differences among individuals and populations. Darwin also recognized that survival and reproductive success is variable, right, among different individuals. So here we're talking about evolutionary fitness, right, the ability to successfully produce offspring that can then survive to reproductive age. So again, he recognized that there's variation, right, among different individuals, and ultimately, it just by chance, it can turn out that individuals with certain heritable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than others. And those would be the ones likely to be selected for in successive generations. So these fundamental ideas, that's essentially how he was able to explain the diversity that he was seeing among these mockingbirds, right, among the different islands within the Galapagos. More broadly, of course, this is how he was able to explain the diversity of life on Earth. So that concludes our brief introduction to evolution by natural selection.